Welcome back to our third video in Hebrews chapter 11. We've got up to verse 20 now and we're starting to look at Isaac onwards. The writer has gone chronologically through various characters in the Old Testament, and we've had a section on Abraham in the last section, and then before that we had an introduction to what faith is all about and three characters from early Genesis. But now we're up to Isaac, and he in the last verses he was almost sacrificed as a child, and in verse 20 now he's about to die. So got to get the point here. What is this all about? So verse 20 then, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regards to their future. Now this was not an unknown future, just an unseen one. They will have carried the stories from their granddad Abraham in their hearts, stories of God's promised land yet to be fulfilled. Verse 21, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on top of his staff. That staff might have reminded us that this was the man who had wrestled with God and was left with a limp. The man who said, I won't let go while he was wrestling until you bless me. Verse 22, by faith Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. Of all the stories that we could have used to illustrate Joseph's faith, we're back to the death scene. Wow. I think this is because it's here that the most important focus of faith is revealed, the promised land. And for us, our promised land is heaven. The promise spoken to Abraham many years before had not left Joseph. Faith is acting today in line with tomorrow's hope. And that's what Joseph did when he said, I don't want my burial to be finalised here in Egypt. I belong somewhere else. When the Exodus did eventually take place, Joseph's coffin was carried from Egypt just as he requested. Verse 23, by faith Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Let's hear it for godly parents. Moses is one key figure in Jewish history, and here his parents get some of the credit. They were not afraid of the king's edict. Seems like a throwaway line, could be read quickly, but this took great courage. It was a great personal risk to themselves to hide Moses. That's why they're mentioned as doing this by faith. They trusted God with their lives. Verse 24, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now this was not some teenage rebellion that he'd later regret. This was about his true identity. I am who God says I am. Moses grew up with Pharaoh's oppression of the Hebrew slaves in full view. He also knew that he belonged to God's people, and he chose to identify himself with them, despite the fact that in the world's eyes this would be political suicide. The next verses unpack this choice. Verse 25, he chose to be ill-treated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. This solidarity in suffering reminds the readers of the previous chapter, which praises the original recipients of the letter for suffering alongside those who were persecuted for their faith. It's there in chapter 10, verse 33. Back in 11, verse 26, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. That's Moses. Well, that's a bit of a surprise. Moses considered his suffering to be for the sake of Christ. Quite early to be thinking about Christ, isn't it? Is the writer just trying to apply what Moses went through to his readers, the followers of Christ? Maybe. But in a sense, Moses was willing to suffer for the sake of advancing God's plan of salvation, which ultimately points towards Christ. Moses might not have worded it that way himself, but in the grand scheme of things, Moses was suffering for the cause that Christ's suffering, death and resurrection actually finalised. Verse 27, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. It's another interesting verse, as Moses did leave Egypt the first time for a place called Midian, and he left in fear. It says in Exodus 2. But we know by now that our author knows the scriptures very well, better than I do. So he will have known that Exodus 2 states that Moses left in fear. So I think he's probably just clarifying the fear that Moses had was not fearing Pharaoh, but as Exodus suggests, his fear was about his violent action that he'd just done becoming public knowledge. And one idea is that if he'd have stayed around, he might have started a slave revolt there and then. Anyway, still in verse 27, what we do know is that Moses saw him who is invisible. When we have a revelation of who God is, when we see the God who is invisible, we're able to act in faith. Faith that trumps our fear. Verse 28, by faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. The application of blood has been an important theme, and here, by faith, Moses and the Israelites were able to spare their firstborn children. Verse 29, by faith the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. Having listed all these heroes, it's nice to see that the people are credited with faith too. We need to have faith collectively and not just rely on our leaders or our parents' faith to see us through. By contrast, the Egyptians, having no faith, drowned. Now, these Exodus events we have just been talking about are absolutely pivotal in Jewish history. If you ask a Jewish person today, what's the most important thing in your history or the most significant event, they'll talk about the Exodus. And the author here is letting readers know that these events all took place by faith. Verse 30, by faith the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched round them for 7 days. Just like it's the people's faith that is mentioned with the crossing of the Red Sea, here Joshua's not even mentioned at all. But it took the whole Israelite army to follow God's instructions. And how ridiculous it must have seemed to some of those soldiers, maybe, if they didn't have spiritual sight, in the natural, to see these grown men marching around these thick city walls day after day. Verse 31, by faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. In Joshua 2 verse 9, Rahab declares, I know that the Lord has given this land to you. But how humbling and forward-thinking to include Rahab in this lineup. Look, she was a woman, which in women's rights and equality were not what they are today. They might not be exactly as they should be today, but they were far a lot different in those days. She's the only woman in this list. Also notice she was a Gentile. She was not one of God's chosen people. And she was a prostitute. It's not that we'll let her off because she was a do-gooder. She wasn't deserving. But God loves to take these unexpected opportunities to point out that the grace that the whole story is about. Everything points to Jesus. And in case we've missed it, as we entered the promised land, we're reminded that God's salvation and entry to heaven is open to all who believe, regardless of race, gender, or background. But we're running out of time, and so was our author by the looks of it. Verse 32, and what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets. Verse 33, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions. Verse 34, quenched the fury of the flames and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Amazing things happening because of faith, but none of this happens without disturbing our spiritual enemy. And this passage on faith also lets us know that true faith often brings us up against a world that is going in a very different direction. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Better, that is, than those at the beginning of this verse, those who were brought back to life on earth. Verse 36. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted and ill-treated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. Some of these will have been fresh in the minds of the original readers. The writer wishes to encourage them that faith leads to an even better resurrection, a future hope that outshines anything on this earth. Sometimes God delivers those who live by faith, and at other times he allows them to undergo suffering for his name. In the New Testament we know that James, the brother of John, was put to death by the sword, and yet God delivered Peter from the same. The point of this passage is this, verse 39. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. Wow. Since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. None of these people, in all their faith ventures, however great heroes they were, none of them received the ultimate promise that all of history was and now is building up to. The Old Testament heroes were awaiting the coming of Christ. Only together with us, the new covenant people, could they be made complete in every way through the fulfillment of God's promise in Jesus. In the time gap between God's promise and fulfillment, faith is what is required to bridge that gap. And then we can press on towards the things that we're hoping for in God's promise.